Hey, this is Minute Book Reports, and in this video I want to talk about The Reptile Room, which is the second book in a series of unfortunate events. And I want to talk about the book as well as the Netflix show. So I'm going to talk about the book first, and then I'm going to kind of go over all of my notes that I made as I was watching the episode and just sort of some of my thoughts and commentary, especially in comparison to the book. But when I talk about the Netflix show, I want to talk about it in the context of the book, because I believe that the book is the source material and the adaptation is the Netflix series, and I don't want to get those two mixed up. So first, the book. It's a very short read, as was the first book, and I'm starting to think all the other books are also going to be pretty short. So I think it's worth reading the book itself. It's a very nice transition from the first book to the second book, where they're traveling along that lane, and they basically get dropped off at their uncle's house, Uncle Monty, and I really like his character. He seems to be very positive, very much a contrast to Count Olaf. At first, I thought the story was going to be where they travel from aunt or uncle to aunt or uncle, and they just get worse and worse and worse. But I'm glad that they actually have some very nice relatives, and Uncle Monty is definitely one of them. He's smart, and he's very energetic, and he wants the children to be involved in his research, which is studying snakes. There's a section in the book and also in the show where they sort of pause to talk about dramatic irony, and I really appreciate that, because for young readers it helps them to sort of understand a sort of a literary device, something that authors can use in their stories, and they take the time in this story and in the show to sort of go over what that means. I thought it was kind of unusual that the reveal for Count Olaf happened pretty early on in the story when Stefano basically walked in to their house. The kids recognized him instantly, but everyone else kind of took a long time, and it's kind of a weird position to put the reader in, where the reader and children know that the bad guy is right there standing in front of everyone, but no one seems to believe the kids. And it's only until the end that they figure out and everyone sort of realizes who he is. Most of the time in stories, the villain, if they want to remain hidden, they remain hidden to sort of everyone. But in this story, it's revealed very early so that the reader, which would be probably children, and the children in the actual story, they understand what's going on. So I find it to be very, very odd where the rest of the story is sort of playing catch up. One of the best parts of this book is when they sort of pause to reflect on unexpected deaths, and they do this in the show, but they really take the time in the book, I felt, to sort of explain that, you know, death is just a part of life. Everyone knows that people will die, but it's always a sad and shocking feeling when it's with someone that we know, and I thought that was a really great point that they brought up in the book. I remember when I was younger and I read Charlotte's Web, and Charlotte ends up dying in the book, the spider, and I thought, well, I didn't know that could happen, because I had grown up with cartoons, and usually in cartoons, the villain usually gets away or they somehow recover by the next episode. So it was never really a problem where villains or even good guys died. But to have that happen in Charlotte's Web, I remember as a kid, I was kind of confused. I thought, well, when is she coming back? Is there going to be a second book? But in fact, she lives on through her children, which Wilbur then sort of takes care of. So I'd be very curious to know what children think about when they face a character who dies, especially sort of early on in the story, and they're kind of trying to figure out what happens. But overall, I really liked the book. I thought it was a very quick read. It was really easy, and it sort of again sets up the next story where the children are going to be moved to the next relative. So now I want to talk about the show, and I have my notes here about the show. And the first thing that I noticed is that Uncle Monty in the show is very likable. I thought he was a lot more likable in the show, in the Netflix series, than the actual book. And that's not to say that he wasn't likable, but in the show, he was very personable. Like, he had a lot of plans, and I guess because of his relation to the parents and how close that he was to the parents, I guess they sort of tied in the bond between him and the rest of the children. In the book, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like he's very busy with his own life, his research, and he really likes his research. He wants the kids to come along with him, and he wants them to be a part of his life, but not to the extent, I think, of actually being a tight family, more to the extent of him having sort of assistants and helpers, and a lot more emotional, I felt, in the show. One of the things that I noted when they first met was when he was offering them cake, and I just remember thinking when he offered Violet a cake, she can't eat it because she's carrying Sunny. And again, that's where I feel like I wish Sunny was a little bit older, where she could walk on her own and she didn't have to be carried, because she sort of takes out one of the characters and sort of limits one of the main characters, either Klaus or Violet, because she's always having to be carried by one of them. And so I kind of wish that she was a little bit older, but I remember noting that when he offered, or she was offered the cake and she couldn't actually eat it. The next thing I want to note is that the reptile room looked really good. It was basically what I had imagined in my mind, where there were exhibits across every single table, and sort of in the corner there was this large cage that had the incredibly deadly viper, which I thought they did a really great reveal. I remember in the book where they had a sort of a chapter break where the snake actually bit Sunny, I believe, and so I was kind of hoping to see that. They sort of allude to that Sunny was bitten, but they never actually showed it. I guess that's fine. They don't actually have to show that, but it was not really going to hurt her. So I thought it was kind of interesting that they didn't show that in the show, but I guess it doesn't really matter since the snake wasn't deadly at all. So I remember in the book distinctly there was a set of windows that you could sort of see out into the courtyard, and that actually played a big role in the story in the book. But they didn't really have that in the Netflix series. They did have windows that were transparent, and it somewhat looked like a greenhouse. But they didn't have that, what I pictured, a big sort of open window, or at least a lot of windows where you could see directly to the car, because that was where Count Olaf was able to see Violet sort of going through his stuff. So it took a long time for Uncle Monty to wrongly guess who Stefano was, and they sort of had this confrontation in the parking lot of the theater. But I feel like in the book, Uncle Monty sort of guessed wrong, sort of miscalled who Stefano was a lot earlier, and I think it was in his house when that happened. And so for the rest of the story, he just sort of plays along, but he sort of identifies him earlier. In a Netflix show, it's sort of misleading where we think that as the viewer, Uncle Monty understands who Stefano is, and the kids are like, all right, he's finally gonna get caught. But then there's a misunderstanding in exactly who he was. And the last thing from episode 3 that I want to mention is the movie scene where Uncle Monty is using the sort of the spy scope to watch the movie, which was terrible. But it was interesting because I never seen any sort of device like that where they try to hide a hidden message into the actual sort of subtitles of the story, and it leaves a message for Uncle Monty to take the kids to Peru. And I thought that was a very interesting and clever thing that wasn't in the book. And I'm not sure exactly where they came up with that, because I know that in the following story, in The Wide Window, the kids are able to decipher a note from Aunt Josephine, which is very, very clever. But that's the first time that they actually have to do that. Now, by introducing that idea of hidden messages and secret codes, we can expect in a Netflix series a lot of hidden messages, and we expect the kids to be able to figure them out consistently. I did feel like it took away of the genuineness of Uncle Monty to taking the kids to Peru, because I felt like in the book, he wanted to take them to Peru because he wanted them to be a part of his research, and he was very much excited, and he was very much inclusive in that. But in Netflix series, although he did buy the canoe, it seemed like an afterthought that he should take them to Peru, because as we see in the show, the parents end up there somehow through sewers. So I feel like I liked it a lot more in the book, that it was more organic, that the uncle wanted them to be a part of it rather than just sort of a mission. So in episode 4, which is part 2 of the Reptile Room, I really didn't have much notes because I was sort of very invested in what was actually happening in the story. I felt like they did a really great job with the scene where they're trying to figure out what to do with Uncle Monty's body, because in the book it was very unclear, and I felt like it was kind of a slow part of the book, because basically in the book what happens is the adults are kind of arguing and trying to figure out the logistics on how to get the kids and everyone basically to town. But in the show, it felt like it was a big spectacle because it had the whole cast, it had all of Count Olaf's accomplices as police and nurses and everything. And so it made it a little bit more reasonable, because I remember reading in the book, I didn't understand why it took them so long to figure out who was going to go in whose car just so they could get into town. It seemed ridiculous that was the reason that they couldn't go into town, that they were stuck in the house. But in the show, they took care of that by sort of declaring that the house was under quarantine because they had to find the snake. So I thought that was a very clever workaround. At first, I didn't like the fact that the other accomplices were involved, and I assumed they're going to be involved every step of the way. Because in the book, it kind of felt like it was just Count Olaf in disguise and one of his accomplices, and that was it. And it felt like a mini boss, you know. In reading the stories, it felt like there was the mini boss who was Count Olaf's accomplice, and then there was Count Olaf every time. And it felt like a Mario game where you have like the mini boss, and then you have, you know, Koopa, and then you defeat them, and then he kind of runs away, and then you got to defeat them again. That's sort of what I'm understanding the story to be, at least as I'm reading the books. But in the show, it's very much everyone, and the kids have to sort of defeat all of the accomplices, including Count Olaf, every single time, which is fine. That's a very clever formula, and it gives them a lot more personality, because in the book, you hardly have any time to get to know the accomplices because they are often off to the side and they're incognito, they're in disguise, they're supposed to be hidden. But here, we're kind of getting to know them, and they're kind of fun, they're kind of interesting, they make a lot of jokes, and they use them a lot for, I think, very timely comedic humor. I think the runtime for this show is about 2 hours, which kind of got me thinking I probably could read the book in just about the same amount of time. I'm still trying to get used to the fact that there is some kind of secret agent, secret society going on, and that was sort of highlighted at the end of episode 4, and it's something that the books do not have. And I'm starting to understand maybe why they incorporated that into the show, because it's very alluring, it's very intriguing. It makes us want to watch the next episode, because again, there's this bigger story happening besides just these kids being sort of tossed around to different family members. It's sort of this big conspiracy and this big secret society that we're trying to understand, and the kids are trying to understand, even though they're not quite aware of it, but the characters right on the fringe are, and it feels like the relatives are all in on this except them. So those are my thoughts on the Reptile Room. Again, I thought the book was great. It's a very short read, very straightforward story, very enjoyable. And in terms of the show, I thought they did a really great job. They brought in some really great colors of greens, and they brought in some animals, and it was very nice. They portrayed Uncle Monty very well in the show, and I really liked that. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.